Today we have a talk from Rob Leechmere of Jonathan Tuckey Design. That's a practice that has significant experience of working with historic buildings, and Rob will be touching on his practice experience and how best practice, looking at best practices for working with such buildings. The premise of LSA CPD is that they're 30-minute talks and 30-minute discussions. We've put big focus on a discussion because we feel architects and stakeholders within the industry get more from such sessions by asking the key questions that are pertinent to them rather than being simply talked to. And hopefully we can get some succinct messages out with that talk as well, particularly from the esteemed speakers we have. And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rob over here. And if I stop share, there we go.
Great.
That should be over to you now, Rob. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so just Jason, you can let me know if you can
You can see that?
Yeah, great. Okay, so as Jason said, Jonathan Tuckey Design. We're currently 18 people. We're based in London, and we specialise in transforming and rethinking existing buildings. Today, I'm going to be talking about 3 projects and talking about possibly best practice, but I think the discussion will enlighten that. And it'll be talking about how to deal with listed building and planning, and to a certain degree, technology we use, and ideas about what we should keep and what we should change in existing buildings, and how you come up with those decisions. So the first project is up on Wimpole Street. It's in Marylebone, and here's a area map, and the kind of blue properties are listed buildings, and you can see our project here in the darker blue, and it's a grade 2 listed building, and our project was the ground floor flat. It's a 2-bedroom apartment, and I'll show you some photos. So it hadn't been loved over the last decade or so, and it had some additions made to it, like a conservatory and this kind of outrigger to the back, and the floor was a kind of modern ply floor, so engineered timber ply, and it just generally needed a lot of care. It had kind of these ceilings with spotlights in, and just a bit leaky and a bit run down. So the client asked us to rethink the apartment and kind of deal with hiding their everyday life. Kind of, they didn't want all of this stuff on display, so kind of making a intervention that would make the flat a lot more legible in terms of the architecture that was already there, and yeah, hiding all the stuff, like a lot of joinery we imagined. So you can see the kind of front room, which is their bedroom, and not a lot of storage for them, but it still had these kind of very nice original features, just cornice work and ceiling rose here. So here's the existing plan, and you can see the entrance to the building is here for a communal corridor space, and you come into this kind of vestibule space here, and a large bedroom at the front with an ensuite bathroom, living room, and then this kind of addition to the back of the house, either side, so a small bedroom, conservatory and kitchen. Here is the kind of light well to the basement flat, and it had a small outside garden. So looking at the apartment, and the idea of kind of hiding stuff away, we looked at these studies that Louis Kahn did of castles, and the idea of rooms within walls was a kind of theme we wanted to explore. So how could we make new space in the apartment without knocking down stuff, as it were, making extra thickness of the walls and playing with the thickness of the walls. So this is William Chambers' plan for the casino at Marino, just outside Dublin. And the way, by changing wall thicknesses, you can create kind of auxiliary spaces to them, storage. And because it was a listed building, we thought this was a good way to kind of make larger intervention without demolishing things. And the idea of creating architectures within a architecture, like creating rooms within rooms. And so we're inspired by these Renaissance paintings by an artist called Messina, I think it was. And it just happened that the colors from these kind of leached through into the final project as well. And here's a drawing we made, kind of discussing the plan and the facade together and how the proportions of each kind of worked, and did they influence each other. And you can kind of see our kind of start of an intervention here with these kind of creating smaller kind of antechambers inside larger spaces, and then making wall thicknesses as storage. So our initial proposal for like listed building consent and planning was, to rip out this area here, make this window wider, which is kind of less controversial because it's in a newer part of the building, take away this nib to create this kind of more fluent connection between these two spaces, reorganize this bathroom space. And we're also hoping to make this connection between the living room and the vestibule space larger with a kind of full height arch. I suppose one tactic we use sometimes on our projects is to put in more changes than we actually want to make, so that when the listed building officer or conservation officer then goes, oh no, you can't do all that, we have some which we can then trade with them. We can say, oh, okay, we won't do these then, and then they seem happy and we got what we wanted in the end anyway. It's a kind of one tactic we sometimes use. We also split the applications into two. So we had one for the main internal works, but then we had one for the sash windows on the front of the property. The client was very insistent. They wanted new sash windows on the front of the property with better acoustic and thermal properties. So this building is in the Harley Street Conservation Area, being a Grade 2 listed building. The likelihood of kind of getting replacement sashes we felt was quite low. But then we kind of thought, how do we kind of play the kind of conservation officers at their own game? And looking at the style of the windows for the age of the property, they have Victorian style sashes in a Georgian property here. So we put forward the argument that a 6/6 style Georgian sash is probably more in keeping with the existing property, and we managed to get permission for it. The Marylebone Association didn't really like it, but yeah, we managed to get that for the client, which we were very pleased about. And so here's the kind of final plan. And you can see how we've used joinery pieces with kind of little changes to the existing fabric to create extra rooms and extra spaces, a dressing room in a larger bedroom, and create all this storage around the edge here. Also reorganizing the kitchen into a study and moving the kitchen down so it has a kind of a relationship with the garden. And then, as I'm sure a lot of people here kind of experience, when you start working with old buildings, you find things which you don't want to. So here in one of the bathrooms, when we were taking a bit of plaster off, we found a huge crack and had to get an engineer's opinion of that, and it was just happened to be settlement, and there's nothing to worry about in this case, which was fortunate. We did, however, find some very suspect ventilation and fire-lined very badly rises going from the lower ground floor through the building, and this was something we had to correct at the client's expense. Although we tried to get the freeholder involved, they didn't really want to pay anything towards it, which we thought was a bit unfair. Also, doors. We went to strip all the doors with the impression that they were solid wood doors, and turned out that they weren't. And lots of the panels were MDF, and so from the stripping process, the MDF was ruined. So we had to end up kind of replacing the infill panels of all these kind of 6-panel doors, which was another kind of strange discovery. When we uncovered the floor, we took away the kind of modern engineered ply floor. We uncovered the kind of pitch pine floorboards, and this was kind of during construction. At this point, the client then decided that they would actually like to keep and restore the floorboards, which was fine, but it had large implications to the program. And also, you know, if we are going to restore the floorboards, there's building regulations to do with acoustic barriers between this flat and the flat below. So we'd have to take up all the floorboards to restore them and lay sub layers below them. And when you take up the floorboards, you find all sorts of things like this. So we try to leave this alone as much as possible, especially since we'd have to start serving kind of party structure notices if we start changing the joist. So we did it through laying layers of ply on top of the joists, and then acoustic layers, and then laying the refurbished floorboards on top of them. So we did it that way. Ideally, I would have liked to have maybe put some noggins in between and strengthened the existing joists that were there, but I think program and the neighbor downstairs kind of meant we had to do a kind of a more or less kind of invasive approach. And here's some photos of the kind of finished product, and you can see the floor there and the joinery around the wall, the vestibule, and you can kind of see the reference from earlier on in the project here, the kind of casino at Marino, the kind of oculus and curved vestibule space, and coming through the arch into the main bedchamber through the kind of dressing room. Some more photos here. Looking back through the vestibule to the living room. So the second project I'm going to talk about is our office, and it's Milsom Road in West London and Kensington. And it's a former pub in the bottom of a kind of Victorian, I think very early Victorian block. It's been a number of different pubs. So this one's from the 90s called the Jam Tree. And then when we got it, it was the Underbrook. And here's the kind of existing plans as we found it. So the kind of barrel hatch here, and then large, deep plan with here, this line just being the main glazing. So the kind of, one of the main problems we had with turning this into an architecture studio is the kind of amount of light that would get from here to here, and also to the basement area. So we were going to use all the existing kind of vaults for the beer and turn them into kind of individual rooms for use in our kind of work as an architecture practice. Here's a photo of the basement as we found it. So you can see it's a bit of a mess there, and the floor level was very different from the one we wanted to achieve. But it did have the quality of these vaults, which, you know, were damp and just brick with no kind of waterproofing on them. And it also had these lovely kind of cross brace ceiling between the joists here, which, you know, wanted to keep as much of the original character as possible, but it had to work functioning as our architecture studio. So kind of early sketches showing how we thought of pulling the actual working floor slab away from the wall and creating large atrium down here and circulation space. So bringing light from these windows in here, and also creating this as all open to the windows through a kind of joinery piece. So here's the kind of final design. To a ground floor. Introducing pavement lights as well from the street outside into these vaults, so kind of creating very atmospheric spaces. And then the basement, in its two iterations, one as our day-to-day office, and then one as a lecture theatre for, we have talks here on building on the built series. Yeah, so a multifunctional space as well. So here was like an early sketch of how we would deal with the structure of kind of creating this intervention and making it as light touch as possible. We really enjoy the work of Karmasi in our studio, and he's kind of use of very fine metal as a kind of very yeah, not intrusive intervention, but highlighting it as well, so showing what is new and what is old. So I think we'll be able to see this in this model, showing how the new studio would almost be a large piece of joinery inside the existing pub, with these pieces of structure highlighted there in grey. And a drawing, again showing how the space would work. And then how we would deal with the facade, a kind of quick sketch early on. And then reflected in the final thing here. This is in the summer, just working outside and enjoying and having this relationship with the neighborhood as well. Although it's not a pub anymore, we like to think of it as a kind of public space. This in working mode, then as a gallery. So yeah, inviting the local community in to kind of experience the building as well, and enjoy our talks and when we have exhibitions on. So here you can see how that cutting away of the floor slab works, and how we've managed to keep a lot of the original joists here, and then this structure system highlighted as a kind of something new in the space as well. And the vault. So throughout the basement, we introduced a delta membrane system with a sump. It was quite challenging, I think, because of the form of the vaults to use this system. I wasn't a project architect on this project, but I think Katerina, who would testify it was quite a challenge to get the original form reflected as much as possible after putting in this membrane. Now, Backlane, this is a project I'm working on currently, which is quite interesting in terms of ballistic building and planning. It's in rural Sussex, on the edge of an area of outstanding natural beauty, and it's a standalone building which dates from several different periods, which I'll come on to in a second. So a view from the lane going down towards the building, and then some photos of the building. So you can see here, it's beautiful stone facade on one part of the building with this crest of the local estate it once belonged to. And then towards the back of the building, stone but with hung clay tiles disguising a wooden frame behind. Again, this part of the building, brick at the bottom, hung clay tiles to probably reconcile those two parts of the building. Another view of that corner showing how the stone part relates to the hung clay tile part. And just get these really lovely kind of features around where the clay tile meets the stone, and the drainage, and the chimneys. It's got numerous chimneys that were kind of reflected in the plan. It's kind of lots of individual fireplaces throughout. And then you get this, just lovely patinated stone with all these tool marks on. So, this part of the building, we kind of felt it was very sacred, and we shouldn't touch it, as it should have the least done to it. Just down the lane, about 20 meters away, is this stone barn also, which is probably considered part of the property, with these, I think they're called French trusses. An engineer has told us there's this beautiful structure in there. So we're not actually doing any work to this part of the property in this phase, but for planning circumstances, sorry about this, there's a phone going off in the office. For planning circumstances, we think a planner or a conservation officer more likely would see this as quite an important and valuable architectural feature, and it might be one of the reasons they might want to list a property. The property is not currently listed, which is why we think it's quite an interesting project to show at this point. So we've got these hand sawn oak boards, very old, lovely thing to keep. But then there's also other parts of the project which aren't so nice, these kind of more modern additions, which we would like to get rid of. Also, the way the building's ceiling heights are quite challenging to a way we like to live in, like a modern house. It's quite low ceilings and quite dark, and in small individual rooms. So that can be seen here in the plan. Lots of small rooms, multiple stairs, and a kind of very confused circulation going through the building. So our intervention seeks to kind of clarify that and make this a large space for living in the way the client wishes to live now, with I suppose it's open plan, with bringing in way more light with this large bay window, and kind of isolating the kind of services and utility here, but then also having the plan reflect the formal aspect of the front of the house. So the stone part of the house will have a far more symmetrical, formal plan, whereas the back of the house, which is the older part, it's still quite eccentric in its own way. And here, coming up onto the second floor, the existing plan still quite confused, and then we hoping to make this a double height space above the main living area. And again, the kind of third floor or second floor, I'd say, it's kind of split level. So again, creating more bedrooms here in the attic space as well. So here's some model photographs showing how those changes to the plan play out on the facades. So here at the front, we've got this kind of stone part of the building which we're not touching, and then at the back of the house, introducing this large double height bay window, introducing these mansard type windows here, large double opening space here, and then a new cutaway window here to the new dining room. And again, this part of the house is where we're kind of hoping to make the most alterations. So looking at the house in terms of its age and how it's been added to over the years, number one you can see here is probably 1700s or earlier, so it's a very, very old piece of building. And here later, so prior to 1874, and then the actual, like, most formal, I'd say enjoyable from material point of view, part of the house is one of the oldest. It's 1901, and then small additions inside come later in 1950s. So here you can see the kind of the way that plays out on the floor plan. So with the building being quite an interesting building, it's got quite a noble facade and it's got some very, very old parts of it. We had to make the decision whether by submitting it for planning, it might get spot listed. And if so, it would probably hamper the way we wanted to make changes to the building. And it may mean that the client found the building uninhabitable to the way they wanted to live their lives. So it's kind of making a judgment and a balance between, is a building going to be an aspect and not change, or is it going to be a living building and be habitable for the new family who wants to live there? And so we have decided to make as much change to the internal parts of the building without having to submit it for planning, as a kind of phase one. So we are currently, this is going to start on site in about a month's time. So we're taking out all these walls, taking out the floor, these walls, and taking all these out. So all these changes can be made without planning because they're all internal and don't affect the exterior look of the building. And then once we've made those changes, we will then submit it for planning in the hope that once we've made all these changes, the building is less, I'm going to say a conservation officer might find it less appealing to actually list it. Yeah, so that's where we are on that. And I think that concludes the talk.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Rob. And I appreciate, with this subject, you can only present kind of through case studies. So thank you for presenting a broad range of typologies to demonstrate various examples. I've got a list of questions, but I can see we've got one in already from Peter. I would encourage others to do so if you think of some. Peter asks, could you elaborate on the front window design? You mentioned lint was better acoustics. What lint wanted better acoustics? How was this done? Double glazed, secondary glazing, or secondary glazing?
On the first project,
I would believe so, yes.
Yeah, it was done through a laminated glass, which was a very special, expensive type of glass, and I can send the actual specification of it after, if supplies a contact address. And it also had good thermal qualities. And then the window frames were new. The glazing bars were not through bars. They were made to look like they were through bars. Because if you have lots of small pieces of glass, it's going to be less thermally and acoustically. It's going to have less good performance than having one large piece of glass and then making it look like it is many separate ones. Yeah.
I hope that answers your question, Peter. If not,
But I can send all the details and the information about that.
Awesome, thank you. I was going to ask, a lot of what you do kind of amplifies the building's history that is already there.
Yeah.
And given you kind of riff on the architecture, which is pre-existing, kind of what is the decision-making process in your studio with regards to this? And then how do you present that to planners? Is it something you find you have to end up kind of using as justification? Like, this is how we make our, this is how we've gone about this, or do you just present it as, this is why, etc., etc.?
I think we try and focus on parts of the building that we enjoy and that we kind of know planners will also enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
So normally things that are decorative or have a kind of a sturdiness to them or a kind of importance to them. Maybe that's like tectonically or I don't know what the building was used as. So I suppose if it has a particular function as a building, if it's something in there that relates to that function. We're doing a hotel in Norway, which is an old cod cod liver oil factory, and in there it's got these wooden chutes that were used to throw the cod down. And so I suppose keeping those in there that directly relates to the history of the building
Yeah,
is something we've done there. Yeah, I think planners or conservation officers and architects sometimes disagree on what is the important part of the building. And I think that's knowing what a kind of planner might think, and knowing what you want to keep is always a good skill to have, and try
sure.
and second guess them.
So you got to really got to get to know your planner, I guess, in that sense, or who you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose early dialogue is always really useful, but it's easier said than done,
Hmm.
especially the way, planning departments are overstretched and, won't really speak to you unless you have a application number.
Hmm. With regards to kind of systems and services, um, do you attempt to kind of integrate into existing services that may be antiquated? If there's, a lot, some of the last project did some particularly nice detailing. Do you kind of keep some stuff just for show in that case, or how much do you try to integrate existing services which may be, often will be definitely be outdated, or how are you trying? What's your approach, I guess, to
Yeah.
overcoming them?
Well, we try and do things as light touch as possible,
Yeah.
and try and use as ecologically sustainable things. It's kind of passively ventilating properties, and having a window open we always find is kind of preferable to put an MVHR in. But some clients will really want that.
Mhm.
um here, like the kind of rainwater goods are amazing. There's such a beautiful
Yeah.
language on here, and we would definitely just work with those, or if we had to change them, kind of replicate them there. um in terms of heating, and I suppose we try to use underfloor a lot of the time. um um I'm trying to think of other ways we introduce. I suppose something we like to introduce to a lot of our projects now is like kind of air source or ground source heat pumps as a kind of way of getting energy. And I suppose these can be hidden away,
Mm.
and they're not very intrusive, and they make the building a lot better for this kind of era. Yeah.
Yeah, that's gonna be a follow-up question of that. A lot of these buildings will not be up to kind of current standards with regards to
No.
energy. So,
Yeah, I suppose in non-dwelling houses you have the kind of consequential improvement kind of rule.
mhm,
And I think originally that was going to be extended to dwelling houses, but it never was. And in terms of insulating these buildings, we take a view of not trying to fight against moisture, but let the moisture kind of permeate it. And we use like products. I think it's Pavatech. Use this Isolair, which is a wood fiber board, and we use lime predominantly to make sure moisture isn't trapped if you like insulate internally in between the new insulation and the existing wall.
mhm.
And so it can travel through the building, so the building actually breathes. I think that's a quite an important thing we like to do. I think, yeah, real problems if you start putting modern synthetic materials inside old buildings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see you've got a question from Alan, which I'll read out. And Alan asks, what factors do you consider to be the most time-consuming and perhaps costly in terms of working on existing buildings? Planning, building regulations. What is your view on VAT attached to working on existing buildings? You can see that in the chat as well. I read it
Yeah.
not so well.
um the most time consuming aspect, I suppose, is planning, especially if it's listed. um we had a project down in Somerset where it's a series of barn buildings, and I think the planning process took about 2 years. Just
Wow.
just because it was a very complex project and had thatched roofs and needed like kind of micro method statements for every small part of the project, including kind of like laying floors and which tiles to take up, I think. So I'd say definitely on these types of buildings. But yeah, in terms of VAT, yeah, it seems ridiculous that you have to pay VAT on working with existing buildings when it makes so much sense just to work with what's there rather than knocking things down and building them again. It's a real disaster, I think. Yeah, I think immediately you're starting from such a bad place sustainably if you have to, build something new. Yeah.
Sure. I wanted to ask as well, with regards to kind of any material salvage, do you have any kind of specific approach to this, like any instances where that's been the case? Not with regards to keeping it in place, but
No.
say if you're taking it out and maybe using it again elsewhere, for example, particularly with maybe timber.
Yeah, so on this project, I think you can see here on the probably so got these notes here: all timber floor to be boards to be carefully removed, retained, and stored for reuse. So we definitely like to do that. There's great practice now by I think people in Belgium called Rota BC.
Oh yes, deconstruction is good. Yeah.
Yeah, and who the way buildings are taken apart and catalogued, and I suppose it's the circular economy that they're talking about. It's really inspiring, and we definitely take a view on any materials that can be reused. Yeah, definitely. We try to do that as much as possible.
Sure. Again, by the way, if anyone else has any questions, you can unmute as well, or just type into the chat. I can obviously keep going. You mentioned, I think, with your own studio when designing them, you mentioned in passing a delta membrane system. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on the details of that and what that actually is.
Yeah, so it's like an egg crate plastic that is fixed to the existing wall down there, which creates channels for water to run down the walls, pretty much. And it allows you to create a dry internal surface. So then all this water that runs down the walls will go into a drainage layer underneath your floor and collect at a sump pump, and then is pumped up to regular drainage outlet. Yeah, it's kind of putting a waterproof kind of layer inside. It can get quite technical in terms of junctions, and especially with, like I was saying, unusual forms like those basements there. And if we're doing a kind of new building, we like to use more than just a delta system, kind of, I suppose, belt and braces they call it, using a waterproof material and then putting a delta on the inside just so you're kind of covered. But yeah, yeah, it's quite an interesting system. I think it's quite commonly used now as well, so there's a lot of information about it online.
And with regards to kind of presenting your case towards planners,
yeah,
how often and how are you using precedents of alterations or similar alterations that have been done before in maybe a different conservation area or somewhere else, or in the same area?
Yeah, it's interesting. We definitely use precedent studies when we're looking at how to make these changes. The degree to which planners use planning precedents outside their own borough, I'm not particularly. I don't know. I think they usually have to judge things on a case by case basis. But I suppose the classic one is if lots of people have done the same thing on that road, you're kind of safer to do it. We do occasionally put them in the design and access statement, but to how successful they are in, like, kind of persuading a planner, I think they're more policy based than someone else did it really well somewhere else. Yeah.
Sure. You showed some beautiful models, by the way. I was going to ask, how valuable would you say model making is to you as a studio from a design perspective, as well as kind of, that those are final models, but
So
Go on.
These ones are, so this is still a working model, although it's very
Yeah.
neat.
Yes, true.
Got a great model maker, Izzy, who's working on this project, and even working models kind of look immaculate. I think they're super important. I think COVID has really changed the way we've had to work, actually. So I'm in the studio by myself today, but generally we weren't in the studio, and making a model at home when you don't have all the materials or the tools there is more difficult. So we've had to rely more on 3D. I don't think this has been especially to the detriment of the architecture we create, but it's different looking in a 3D model on your computer screen than working with a physical model. I think that the spatial kind of understanding you get the building and the way things are actually made is just, they're so useful. I couldn't see myself practicing without physical models, even if it seems quite antiquated to some practice now. I think they're just so important.
And obviously the 3D modeling computer is what gets used for drawings, but is that something the planners benefit from seeing these working models? Is that something you show them as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really nice little trick. Sometimes you have a beautiful model, you kind of drop it around the planning department, and they have it sitting in the office there in Kensington and Chelsea, and they'll walk past it every day and go, oh, what's that nice model? And it kind of it ingratiates the project to them a bit, maybe, and so they feel they're part of the team, as it were, rather than a kind of taking an opposition to it. It's they can feel they're going to be someone who let that project proceed and was instrumental in it becoming reality. And I think having as a kind of a joyous, like interesting physical model there is like it can help that. I think I really do.
With regards to the first case study you presented, I was wondering how you kind of convinced planning officers that those previous to you had kind of got it wrong with particular regards to the window. What was that kind of conversation like?
That was I think I was quite fortunate on that project because we had a really nice conservation officer. And it was a discussion outside on the pavement where we were just talking about styles of sash window and almost talking about architectural history, and just saying, well, these are Victorian anyway, probably. And he was like, yeah, you're right. And then he was like, well, if someone put forward a kind of proposal that was more in keeping with the original age of the building, I'd have a hard time arguing against that. So he kind of almost pointed you in the right direction to how you might potentially get around this. Also, like I said, the Marylebone Association did not appreciate this at all, but he stuck to his decision and let them go through. I think he understands that these buildings need to be lived in as well, and in terms of heat loss through these old windows, it's kind of it's not good. But you do have to maintain the kind of physical heritage of these buildings as well. So it's a big balancing act, and sometimes you'll get success like this, and sometimes you won't. I think it really depends on the conservation officer.
Would you say there's a sweet spot between balancing the two kind of tensions of in keeping, I put in inverted commas, or energy rating?
Yeah.
I
think they can make modern sash windows now in the same material except for the glass, and seal them better. And I suppose the main disagreement is whether the original windows, the actual physical thing that was there before, is more valuable than the kind of notion of what that window is, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Whether it's a wooden window with a particular style to it, or whether it needs to be the actual historical fragment of that building.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a difficult one.
Imagine there must be a sweet spot where, clearly you can talk about the savings for that household would be significant.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting when you get building regs and you get listed building and there are odds with each other. So your building inspector is saying, oh, your window, the glass in your window needs to be a lot better than that DU value, and then your conservation officer saying, no way are you changing those windows. So it's kind of the conservation officer usually wins there, I think.
not to the surprise of absolutely no one.
I don't think they really care about your heating bill.
I guess it's going to be the next kind of, the next kind of
sad
frontier, but we need, that is going to be a significant issue moving forward. There's going to be a lot more historic buildings, and those conversations will have to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it does need to happen. Yeah, agreed.
With regards to, again, there's some more tensions as well, kind of spatial quality and materiality with what you have to keep.
Yeah.
How do you decide on what to sacrifice, and which kind of takes precedence in with regards to certain things? Or is it obviously it's a case by case basis, but I didn't know if there was a particular protocol within the office for maybe analysing such situations.
So maybe not in this project, but I suppose the age of construction and the type of construction. I mean, if it's like a particularly rare type of construction, it would definitely take a kind of more importance in our view. I suppose the classic is if you've got like a wall and it's plasterboard and stud work, or it's a kind of lath plaster. I suppose you're going to want to not knock down the lath as much as you are the plasterboard, because it's less special and it's less common these days. I think the same with the kind of construction. I suppose the kind of the craft in the construction as well, the commonness of it. So on that last project, the stone work is just, it's beautiful kind of stone with all these tooling marks on it, and you can imagine the amount of time some stonemason took to do all these individual pieces of stone, and then transport this large amounts of stone to site, compared to I suppose a brick, which is less work. Not to say brick is any less of a material, but I suppose that stone has a real story to it, just really exhibited on its face. I suppose we take kind of aesthetic judgments about things like that. Yeah.
Sure. And how do you think that kind of conversation would be with regards to maybe post-war buildings? Are they something you work with, or is that not particularly an area of that?
Oh, we work with all sorts of buildings. We have we take no like kind of judgment over the kind of age, I suppose. Some are more interesting than others. I suppose some have a kind of great degree of romance to them than others. But no, I think working with kind of buildings from the relative near past can be very interesting as well. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of any projects we've done. We worked on a Walter Siegel house for a time, and got that through planning quite a while ago, which is quite interesting. And it's seeing that type of construction at first hand is very interesting. Yeah.
I was also going to ask a kind of, and there's a lot of kind of like the tensions going on here. What about the tension between kind of conservation and preservation with regards to maybe it's regards to kind of upgrading or dealing with pre-existing elements inside?
Well, I think on this project, it's quite interesting because we had the conservation, we had a heritage consultant produce this, and having a conversation with the heritage consultant and the client together, and the heritage consultant seeing what we wanted to do and taking a very dim view of it. So they were kind of acting as a conservation officer would for the local authority, but their view on how a building should be kind of changed is very different to ours. and but like I said, I think buildings need to be lived in and used, and if they can't change, that can't happen as much. Yeah, I think.
And how often do you find as if, because when you're carving away, you're obviously creating a space, but
Yeah,
if you're creating architecture within an architecture,
yeah,
then you're losing significant space.
yeah.
How is, from not with planners, but maybe with a client, what does that conversation look like when you're having to say to a client, look, we're probably going to lose space here, or we might
Yeah,
we're going to have to knock this wall down to create to make up space, etc., etc.
yeah. Only occasionally you'll have a client, well, this is my experience, that's very attached to a particular part of building. They're more interested in how their house will be lived in on a day-to-day basis. You know, when they come in from work, where they can put their coat, and how they can use the kitchen, and how they imagine using a kitchen, and how big their bedroom is, and things like this. It's kind of from my experience. But got a project in the Alps which has got really old stone walls, and the client there's very, very attached to them and wants to see as much as possible of the old stone walls. And I think there's a battle with having to insulate them internally to make the house livable, and being able to see them. I think that's one example where like the client is very strongly attached to a material used in the building. But yeah, I think you can generally get away with saying to a client, look, we need to knock this wall through to make this plan work.
I
They're
guess it's
kind of like, okay, yeah,
usually the architects get attached to details rather than the client.
yeah,
Got a question from James, which I'll read out, and he asks, by getting the approvals and undertaking the work in stages, do you risk upsetting the planners and ending up in a battle? Do you find it important to get the client on board with this approach in case it is unsuccessful or requires compromises?
yes. To the last part of that question first, making sure the client knows the risks of all these different routes is really, really important. So on this project here, we've let the client knows like explicitly that there is a risk to still, that even though we've done all these kind of changes internally and we've taken out a large portion of what might be like seen as historically important in the building, there is still a risk it may be listed. And at that point, making further changes is going to be more difficult. But the client also knows that the risk of it being listed is far, far reduced by doing this. So if we didn't do these internal changes and went to get planning anyway, the risk of it getting listed and nothing being able to happen is far, far higher. But they definitely know the implications of that, and it has to be their decision as well. I mean, we present these routes, and then they have to choose. Yeah, and annoying the planners. So I suppose the issue there is if your planning officer is also your conservation officer. Most of the time a planning officer would have a good degree of like kind of conservation knowledge. So when they come and look at a building, or at the moment, it's quite good, because I think certain planning authorities just look at the photos because they can't be sending people out because of COVID risk. Yeah, whether they kind of just they don't understand what they're looking at properly, and then kind of just say, oh yeah, it's fine, give it planning, or whether they have a kind of conservation expertise and say, oh, this is a really important special building, we're going to list it. I think they can be annoyed if they kind of they see you've tried to pervert the kind of process, but we are very much within the law here, what we're doing. And the engineer has also kind of we've had inspection pits and exploratory works done, and the existing old part of the building has been changed so much over the years that we feel safe, or let's say less less troubled by doing these changes. I think you know, a planner could get annoyed, but you know, we're not breaking the law, and you know, we're trying to make a family house for like someone to live in. So I don't think I have any moral problems with it, or you know, ethical ones of and planners.
Planners be planning.
Yeah.
I guess I'm conscious of time. I wanted to ask if there's anything that you feel would be pertinent to mention that maybe hasn't been brought up yet, in case you feel as if there's a distinct need to. If not, we can probably bring things to a close.
No, I think no. I can't think of anything immediately. Some really interesting questions there. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.